In a quiet suburban neighborhood where manicured lawns and white picket fences define the landscape, life moved at a predictable pace for Sarah Thompson and her family. The streets were lined with tall oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze, casting dappled shadows on the sidewalks below. It was the kind of place where kids play outside until sunset, neighbors exchanged pleasantries over backyard fences, and everyone seemed to know each other, at least on the surface. Sarah's husband, Mark, was a man of few words but immense presence. A former Marine combat trainer, he had spent years honing his skills in high-pressure situations before retiring to focus on teaching self-defense from their home studio. Though he rarely spoke about his past, his disciplined demeanor and sharp eyes told stories of challenges faced and overcome. Now he spent his days training clients who sought not just physical strength, but also mental resilience. Despite his imposing figure, Mark was known around the neighborhood as a gentle soul who always greeted people warmly. Their son, Ethan, was the light of their lives. A curious, energetic 12-year-old with an insatiable love for adventure. After school, you could almost always find him zipping around the cul-de-sac on his red and black mountain bike. For Ethan, biking wasn't just a hobby, it was freedom. The wind rushing against his face, the rhythmic hum of the tires on pavement. It made him feel like anything was possible. His favorite route took him past rows of tidy houses, under the shade of towering trees, and back to the safety of his own driveway. But beneath the idyllic surface of this picture-perfect suburb lay rules, lots of them. The Homeowners Association, HOA, enforced strict guidelines designed to maintain order and preserve property values. From lawn height restrictions to noise ordinances, nothing escaped their watchful eye. Recently, they had introduced a new policy banning bikes from sidewalks, citing concerns about pedestrian safety and liability. Most residents shrugged it off, assuming the rule would be as loosely enforced as the others. After all, no one wanted to hassle kids just trying to have fun. Enter Ron, a retired security guard turned HOA enforcer, whose zeal for authority bordered on obsessive. With a clipboard perpetually tucked under his arm and a golf cart emblazoned with the HOA logo, Ron patrolled the streets like a sheriff in a small town. He prided himself on being the guy who kept things running smoothly, though many found his methods unnecessarily harsh. His partner, Linda, was quieter but equally committed to upholding the rules, often playing good cop to Ron's bad cop. For weeks, rumors swirled among the neighbors about Ron's increasingly aggressive tactics. One family received a hefty fine for leaving their trash cans out too long. Another was warned about hanging holiday decorations too early. But no one expected the situation to escalate the way it did, or for the Thompsons to become unwilling participants in what would soon unfold. Little did anyone know, the quiet rhythm of this sleepy suburb was about to be shattered, setting the stage for a confrontation that would leave the entire community talking. It was a typical autumn afternoon, the kind where the sun casts a warm golden glow over everything it touches. Ethan had just returned home from school, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder as he wheeled his bike out of the garage. The crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves, and the quiet hum of distant lawnmowers blended with the chirping of birds. For Ethan, this was the perfect time to ride. After finishing his homework, of course. Sarah always made sure of that. With a quick wave to his mom, who was watering the front yard, Ethan hopped onto his bike and pushed off. His wheels crunched softly against the pavement as he began weaving through the cul-de-sac, dodging imaginary obstacles and racing invisible competitors. To anyone watching, he looked like any other kid enjoying an ordinary day in the neighborhood. But what happened next would turn this ordinary moment into something far more intense. As Ethan rounded the corner near the park, he noticed a familiar sight: Ron's golf cart creeping along the curb. Beside him sat Linda, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes with the precision of someone cataloging evidence at a crime scene. At first, Ethan didn't think much of it. He'd seen them around before, usually issuing warnings or handing out flyers about upcoming HOA meetings. They rarely interacted directly with kids, so he figured he was safe to keep writing. But then Ron spotted him. "Hey, you," Ron called out, his voice sharp enough to cut through the peaceful afternoon. "Get off that bike right now." Ethan froze mid-pedal, startled by the sudden command. He glanced around, unsure if Ron was talking to him or someone else. When their eyes met, there was no mistaking it. Ron was glaring straight at him, heart pounding. Ethan slowed to a stop and planted his feet on the ground. "I'm just going home," Ethan stammered, gripping the handlebars tightly. "I'll be quick, I promise." "No excuses," Ron snapped, pulling the cart closer. "You know the rules. No bikes on the sidewalks. Now get off." Linda chimed in, her tone softer but firm. "We're only doing our job, sweetie. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." Ethan felt a mix of confusion and fear bubbling up inside him. He hadn't meant to cause trouble, and the thought of breaking a rule, even unintentionally, made him anxious. Still, he tried to explain himself. "I wasn't hurting anyone. I live right there," he said, pointing toward his house, which was barely a block away. But Ron wasn't interested in explanations. With a growl of frustration, he stepped out of the cart and marched toward Ethan. Before the boy could react, Ron grabbed his arm and yanked him off the bike. Ethan stumbled backward, landing awkwardly on the pavement. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping for breath as tears welled up in his eyes. The commotion drew attention quickly. Neighbors peeked out of windows and wandered onto their porches to see what was happening. Some pulled out their phones, capturing the scene on video. Others shouted at Ron to leave the boy alone. "What's wrong with you?" one woman yelled. "He's just a kid." Sarah heard the noise from her yard and dropped the hose, rushing toward the chaos. Her heart sank when she saw Ethan sitting on the ground, clutching his scraped elbow and looking utterly bewildered. She knelt beside him, asking if he was okay, while shooting daggers at Ron with her eyes. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. "Why are you treating him like a criminal? He's 12 years old." Ron crossed his arms defiantly. "Rules are rules, ma'am. If your son can't follow them, maybe you should teach him better." Linda chimed in again, reciting the HOA policy as if reading from a script. "And we'll need to issue a fine for this violation. We take these matters very seriously." By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring amongst themselves. Some expressed sympathy for Ethan, while others muttered about how the HOA had gone too far this time. As Sarah helped her son to his feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. Whatever peace had existed in their little corner of suburbia was officially broken, and the tension was only beginning to build. When Sarah finally managed to get Ethan back inside the house, her hands were still shaking. She guided him to the couch and gently dabbed at his scraped elbow with a wet cloth, trying to clean the dirt away. Ethan winced but didn't complain. He was too busy replaying the scene in his head over and over again. The look on Ron's face when he yanked him off the bike, the sound of his mother's voice rising in anger, the way people had gathered around like spectators at a car crash. It all felt surreal. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. Her tone was calm now, though her insides churned with fury. Ethan nodded, sniffling. "I didn't do anything wrong, Mom. I swear." "I know," she said firmly, pulling him into a hug. "You didn't deserve that." As much as Sarah wanted to comfort her son, her mind raced with questions. How could someone treat a child like that? What gave Ron and the HOA the right to act as if they were above decency? And what would happen next? She couldn't shake the image of Ron standing there, smug and unapologetic, while her boy sat on the ground, humiliated and scared. By the time Mark walked through the door later that evening, Sarah had pieced together the entire story. She recounted every detail to him, her voice trembling as she described how Ron had grabbed Ethan and refused to listen to reason. Mark listened intently, his jaw tightening with each word. He didn't interrupt or raise his voice. Instead, he let her finish, absorbing every nuance of the situation before responding. When she was done, Mark knelt beside Ethan, who was sitting quietly at the kitchen table picking at a plate of uneaten mac and cheese. "Hey, champ," Mark said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You feeling all right?" Ethan shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "I guess." Mark studied his son for a moment, noting the faint bruise forming on his arm where Ron had grabbed him. It wasn't severe, not the kind of injury that would require a trip to the doctor, but it was enough to ignite something deep within Mark. This wasn't just about rules anymore. This was personal. Standing up, Mark turned to Sarah. "Did you get any names? Any details we can use?" Sarah nodded, recounting everything she remembered about the confrontation. The golf cart, the clipboard, the crowd of neighbors who witnessed it all. Some had even filmed parts of the incident, she added, which might come in handy later. Mark's military training kicked in almost instinctively. He knew that emotions wouldn't solve this problem. They needed facts. "All right," he said, pacing the room as he thought aloud. "First, we need to document everything. Write down exactly what happened, including dates, times, and witnesses. Second, I'll review the HOA bylaws. If they're enforcing these rules, they'd better be doing it legally. Third," he paused, glancing at Ethan, "we make sure no one ever treats you, or anyone else, like that again." Sarah watched her husband with a mix of admiration and relief. While she had spent the afternoon fuming and worrying, Mark approached the situation with precision and purpose. His calm demeanor reassured her, even as she sensed the storm brewing beneath the surface. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Mark pulled out his laptop and began digging into the HOA's policies. What he found surprised him. The bylaws were dense and convoluted, filled with vague language and loopholes. For example, while biking on sidewalks was technically prohibited, the rule applied only during certain hours, and even then, enforcement required warnings before escalating to fines or penalties. There was also a clause stating that enforcers must act reasonably and respectfully in all interactions with residents. Mark highlighted key sections and jotted down notes, his mind working overtime. He realized that Ron and Linda hadn't followed protocol, not even close. Their actions weren't just harsh, they were potentially illegal. But proving it wouldn't be easy. They'd need allies, evidence, and a strategy to hold the HOA accountable. The next morning, Mark decided to reach out to their neighbors. He started with the woman who had yelled at Ron during the confrontation, introducing himself and asking if she'd be willing to share her perspective. To his surprise, she eagerly agreed, revealing that she'd been frustrated with the HOA for months. Word spread quickly, and soon other families came forward with stories of their own. Unfair fines, rude remarks, and unnecessary inspections. As the pieces began falling into place, Mark felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about defending his family anymore. It was about standing up for an entire community tired of being bullied. And if there was one thing Mark Thompson knew how to do, it was fight for what was right. But little did he know, the real battle was yet to come. Mark's plan began to take shape over the next few days, unfolding like a carefully choreographed operation. Drawing on years of experience as a combat trainer and strategist, he approached the situation with precision, knowing that preparation would be key. This wasn't just about confronting Ron and Linda. It was about dismantling the system that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place. The first step was gathering evidence. Mark reached out to neighbors who had witnessed the incident, asking if they'd be willing to share their accounts or any videos they had recorded. Many were hesitant at first, worried about retaliation from the HOA. But when Mark explained his approach, focusing on facts rather than emotions, they slowly warmed up to the idea. One family even provided footage showing Ron aggressively grabbing Ethan off his bike, which could serve as undeniable proof of misconduct. Next, Mark dove deeper into the HOA's bylaws, poring over every line until he knew them inside and out. He discovered inconsistencies not only in how rules were enforced, but also in the qualifications required for enforcers like Ron and Linda. For instance, there was no mention of mandatory training or certification for handling disputes involving residents. It became clear that the HOA operated more like a loosely regulated private entity than a transparent governing body. Armed with this information, Mark decided it was time to escalate matters. He drafted a formal complaint letter outlining the violations and sent copies to the HOA board members, along with supporting documentation from witnesses and excerpts from the bylaws. The tone of the letter was professional yet firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "We are seeking accountability," he wrote in closing, "and we expect immediate action to address these issues." Word of Mark's efforts spread quickly among the neighbors. Some admired his calm determination, while others expressed concern that challenging the HOA might backfire. Sarah occasionally worried aloud about potential repercussions, especially after receiving an ominous voicemail from Ron warning her not to involve outsiders. But Mark remained steadfast, reminding everyone that staying silent would only empower bullies like Ron. To further amplify their message, Sarah contacted local news outlets, sharing the story under the condition of anonymity at first. Journalists were intrigued by the David and Goliath nature of the conflict, a family standing up against a powerful organization, and agreed to investigate. Within days, reporters began reaching out to other residents for interviews, shining a spotlight on the broader issue of HOA overreach. Meanwhile, tension within the neighborhood grew palpable. Ron and Linda seemed to avoid the Thompson street altogether, likely aware that eyes were now watching their every move. Board members started holding impromptu meetings behind closed doors, presumably to discuss damage control. Yet despite their attempts to contain the situation, cracks in the HOA's authority began to show. One evening, as Mark reviewed notes for what felt like the 100th time, Sarah walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one and sat down beside him. "Do you think this is going to work?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. Mark took a sip before answering. "It has to," he said simply, "not just for us, but for everyone here. People deserve better than fear and intimidation." Sarah nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. Though the road ahead promised challenges, she couldn't help but feel proud of her husband and grateful for the courage he inspired in those around them. Little did they know, the real showdown was closer than expected. A notice arrived in the mail announcing an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following week. All residents were invited to attend, though the underlying purpose was left vague. Mark smiled grimly as he read it aloud to Sarah. "Looks like they're finally ready to face us," he said. "Let's make sure we're ready too." With renewed determination, the Thompsons prepared for what lay ahead, knowing that this meeting would either validate their fight or expose its vulnerabilities. Whatever happened, one thing was certain: they weren't backing down without a fight. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived, and the community center buzzed with an energy that hadn't been seen in years. Residents packed the room, some sitting shoulder to shoulder on folding chairs, while others leaned against walls or stood near the back. The air was thick with anticipation, punctuated by hushed whispers and occasional bursts of laughter as neighbors exchanged stories about their own run-ins with Ron and Linda. For many, this was more than just a meeting. It was a reckoning. Mark and Sarah entered together, flanked by Ethan, who clutched his mom's hand tightly. They weren't alone. Several neighbors had volunteered to join them, offering moral support and solidarity. Among them was Mrs. Patel, whose garden had once been fined for having overly colorful flowers, and Mr. Jenkins, a retired teacher who had received a warning for leaving his recycling bin out 1 minute past the designated time. Even those who hadn't personally experienced trouble with the HOA were there, united by a shared desire for fairness. At the front of the room sat the HOA board members, their faces tense and unreadable. Ron and Linda hovered nearby, looking unusually subdued. When the meeting began, the board president, a soft-spoken man named Harold, tried to maintain control, opening with a vague statement about addressing recent concerns. But it quickly became clear that no one was interested in polite formalities. When Mark raised his hand to speak, the room fell silent. He stepped forward, his posture relaxed yet commanding, exuding the same quiet confidence that made him such an effective instructor. Holding up a folder filled with documents, he began laying out the case against the HOA enforcers, piece by piece. "First," he said, his voice steady and calm, "let's talk about the incident involving my son. According to your own bylaws, enforcement actions must be conducted respectfully and reasonably. Grabbing a child off his bike and causing him physical harm does not meet that standard." A murmur rippled through the crowd as he held up a printed copy of the relevant section from the HOA handbook. Someone shouted, "Show them the video." Mark obliged, playing the clip captured by a neighbor. Gasps echoed around the room as the footage showed Ron yanking Ethan off the bike, leaving no doubt about what had happened. But Mark wasn't done. He went on to highlight other examples of misconduct, citing specific instances where residents had been treated unfairly. Each example was backed by evidence, emails, photos, witness statements. By the time he finished, even some of the board members looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in their seats. Ron finally spoke up, his face red with indignation. "This is ridiculous. We're just doing our jobs. If people followed the rules, none of this would happen." His words sparked outrage. Voices erupted from all corners of the room, with neighbors calling him out for his hypocrisy and lack of empathy. One woman stood up, holding her phone aloft. "I've got recordings of you yelling at kids for playing soccer in their own yards. Is that how you treat everyone?" Mark waited patiently for the commotion to die down before continuing. "It's not just about individual incidents," he explained. "It's about accountability. The HOA exists to serve this community, not rule it like a dictatorship. You need transparency, proper training for enforcers, and a system for addressing grievances without fear of retaliation." As the debate raged on, cracks began to form within the board itself. Two members publicly expressed support for reform, agreeing that changes were long overdue. Others remained defensive but seemed increasingly cornered, unable to refute the overwhelming evidence presented by Mark and the residents. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the tide had turned. Neighbors left the room buzzing with excitement, feeling empowered for the first time in years. Ron and Linda slunk away silently, their usual bravado replaced by visible unease. And though the fight was far from over, one thing was certain: the Thompsons and their allies had struck a blow against injustice that wouldn't soon be forgotten. In the days following the explosive HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt like it was waking up from a long slumber. The once oppressive air of fear and compliance had lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility, and even rebellion. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact now exchanged knowing smiles and nods, united by the shared victory they'd glimpsed at the meeting. For the first time in years, people dared to hope that change was possible. The fallout began almost immediately. Under mounting pressure from both residents and local media outlets covering the story, the HOA board announced an internal investigation into Ron and Linda's conduct. While the board initially tried to downplay the severity of the allegations, public sentiment left them little choice but to act decisively. Within a week, Ron and Linda were placed on administrative leave pending further review, a decision met with cheers from many residents. But Mark knew suspending two individuals wasn't enough. The real problem lay deeper: a culture of unchecked authority and lack of accountability within the HOA itself. He continued pushing for systemic reforms, drafting proposals for measures like mandatory training for enforcers, transparent grievance procedures, and regular audits of HOA activities. With Sarah's help, he circulated petitions among neighbors, gathering signatures faster than expected. Even some former skeptics joined the effort, emboldened by the momentum. Meanwhile, Ethan became something of a reluctant hero in the community. Kids in the neighborhood looked up to him, not because of what had happened, but because of how his family had stood up against injustice. Inspired by their courage, Ethan started organizing a petition of his own, advocating for safer biking options in the area. "If they don't want us biking on sidewalks," he reasoned, "then we need bike lanes or trails." His initiative quickly gained traction, drawing support from parents and kids alike. Local news coverage played a crucial role in amplifying the Thompsons' fight. Reporters interviewed residents about their experiences with the HOA, shining a spotlight on broader issues of overreach and abuse of power. One particularly compelling segment featured interviews with families across different neighborhoods facing similar challenges, sparking conversations statewide. Lawmakers took notice, introducing legislation aimed at regulating HOAs and ensuring greater protections for homeowners. For Sarah, seeing her quiet suburban life thrust into the public eye was surreal, but deeply satisfying. She often found herself reflecting on how far they'd come since that fateful afternoon when Ron dragged Ethan off his bike. What had started as a personal battle had grown into a movement, fueled by ordinary people refusing to accept mistreatment any longer. Even Ron and Linda couldn't escape scrutiny. After weeks of silence, rumors surfaced that they had quietly resigned rather than face termination or legal consequences. Though neither issued a formal apology, their departure marked a symbolic end to an era of intimidation. Some neighbors joked about throwing a block party to celebrate. Though cooler heads prevailed, there was still work to be done. By early December, signs of progress were everywhere. The HOA board approved several of Mark's proposed reforms, including monthly town hall meetings where residents could voice concerns directly to leadership. Plans were underway to install designated bike paths along major streets, funded partly by reallocating unused portions of the HOA budget. Most importantly, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. People felt heard again, and empowered to speak out when things went wrong. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mark sat on the front porch with Sarah and Ethan. They watched as kids rode their bikes freely down the street, laughing and calling out to one another. It was a simple moment, but it carried profound weight. "You know," Mark said after a pause, breaking the comfortable silence, "we didn't just win this fight for ourselves. We did it for everyone here." Sarah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And look at what it's done for Ethan," she added, nodding toward their son, who was sketching ideas for new bike trail designs on a notepad. Ethan glanced up, grinning sheepishly. "Does this mean I get my bike back?" His parents laughed, the sound warm and full of relief. The scars of that day would always linger, for Ethan, for their family, and for the neighborhood, but they served as reminders of resilience, unity, and the power of standing up for what's right. Injustice might never fully disappear, but together they had proven it could be challenged and overcome. Months had passed since the HOA scandal rocked the neighborhood, and life in the suburbs seemed to hum with a newfound rhythm, one defined by cooperation rather than control. The once dreaded golf carts that used to patrol the streets were now seen less frequently, replaced by friendly reminders posted on community bulletin boards. Neighbors greeted each other more warmly, their shared struggle having forged bonds that felt stronger than ever. For Ethan, things finally felt normal again, or as normal as they could be after becoming an accidental neighborhood advocate. His petition for safer biking options gained so much support that the local government stepped in, partnering with the HOA to fund the construction of dedicated bike lanes along key routes. By spring, bright green paths wound through the community, inviting kids and adults alike to pedal safely. Ethan often led groups of friends on rides, proudly pointing out features he'd suggested during planning meetings. He wasn't just riding his bike anymore. He was leading the charge for change. Mark returned to teaching self-defense classes, but something about his approach had shifted. Before, his lessons focused primarily on physical techniques, how to block, strike, evade. Now, he emphasized mental resilience and standing up against injustice, drawing from the recent events to inspire his students. "Strength isn't just about protecting yourself," he told them one evening as they stretched on the mats. It's about using your voice and your actions to protect others too. Parents applauded the new philosophy, enrolling their children in droves. Mark's studio became not just a place to learn combat skills, but also a hub for fostering courage and integrity. Sarah found joy in small victories. She noticed fewer arguments over trivial rule violations and more collaboration among residents. The monthly town hall meetings introduced by the HOA reforms gave everyone a platform to share concerns and ideas, transforming what had been a rigid hierarchy into a genuine partnership. Sarah even volunteered to serve on a new advisory committee tasked with reviewing enforcement practices, ensuring fairness remained at the forefront moving forward. Her leadership inspired others to step up, creating a ripple effect of accountability and trust. The HOA itself underwent significant changes. Board members who had resisted reform either resigned or adapted, making way for fresh faces eager to rebuild relationships with residents. Transparency became the cornerstone of their operations, with detailed reports published online and open forums held regularly. Fines were reduced or eliminated altogether for minor infractions, focusing instead on education and dialogue. For the first time in years, people stopped writing letters from the HOA and began viewing them as helpful guides rather than threats. As summer approached, the neighborhood came together to celebrate its transformation. A block party was organized, complete with food trucks, live music, and games for all ages. Children raced down the new bike lanes while parents cheered them on, laughing under strings of colorful lights strung between trees. At the center of it all stood the Thompsons, surrounded by neighbors who thanked them repeatedly for sparking the movement. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Ethan approached Mark later that night, holding out a small trophy someone had jokingly awarded him during the festivities. "Dad," he said earnestly, "do you think we can keep doing stuff like this? Like helping people?" Mark knelt down to meet his son's gaze, pride shining in his eyes. "Absolutely," he replied. "Standing up for what's right doesn't end here. It's a choice we make every day." Ethan nodded thoughtfully before running off to join his friends, leaving Mark and Sarah standing side by side. They watched as fireworks lit up the sky, illuminating smiles and laughter all around. The scars of the past still lingered, the bruise on Ethan's arm, the tension in Sarah's voice when she recounted the story, but they no longer weighed heavily. Instead, they served as reminders of how far they'd come and the strength they'd discovered along the way. In the quiet moments afterward, as the crowd dispersed and the stars reappeared overhead, Sarah turned to Mark. "Do you think we'll ever have peace around here?" she asked, half joking. He smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Probably not completely, but I think we've shown them, and ourselves, that peace is worth fighting for." And with that, the Thompsons walked home together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing they had already proven one thing: even in the face of adversity, unity and determination could create lasting change.